Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and with me today is John Hayes. He is an American food scientist who specializes in sensory and consumer science and eating behavior. He's a full professor of food science at Penn State and director of their Sensory Evaluation Center. And the reason he is here today is to help you understand why we like the foods we like and why we don't like some foods. And this particularly is pertinent to parents of children, especially when they're younger and developing these different food preferences. So we're going to get into that conversation today. But before we begin, John, welcome to the show, and share with our listeners some of your background story, your research interests, and why you got into sensory and taste preferences as an area of research.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Jill, for having me. I really have been looking forward to this. So I have, my favorite thing to do is to sit in a cafe and watch people, right? I find people fascinating, and I find why people do what they do to be fascinating. So in some ways, you could say that I'm really a frustrated psychologist. But I started out with my academic training in food science and earned my bachelor's and master's degree, including a master's in sensory science. And then I took a brief detour, as many men in my generation did, and became a dot-commer briefly, trying to become a dot-com millionaire. And that didn't work out, unfortunately. So I had to fall back on my backup career of being an academic. And I went and I got my doctorate in human nutrition. Now, I'm not a dietitian, and I'm not going to give clinical advice, but the lab that I trained in, everyone there was a dietitian. And so I'm steeped in that culture. So I do feel comfortable with understanding how dietitians see the world. And then after that, I went and I did my doctorates in human nutrition, because I was really interested in nutrition from the neck up, right? I don't particularly find metabolism interesting myself, hugely important stuff. It's not where my interest lays. I really want to know what happens, everything from, when it leaves the farm. I don't know how to grow things. I don't have a green thumb. Farm gate to fork, right? I really want to know why we put the food in our mouth and what drives those food choices. And the answer is everything. Everything drives our food choices, right? Yeah. It's nature, it's nurture, it's both. And we can talk about some of those various details today.
Yeah. So let's talk, just sort of give a general overview of sort of the process of developing food preferences, high level, and then we'll get a little bit more specific with your research.
So as I said, it really is a question of both nature and nurture. So you've almost certainly heard the phrase from your pediatrician, or if you're a pediatrician, you've given the anticipatory guidance that, every food you have to try 15 times.
Yeah.
And as every parent knows, that is a struggle. And I've been there in those trenches, and my kids are older now, but I remember what it was like to try and you're exhausted, you're offering every food over and over and over again. And I'll let you in a little dirty secret. That work was that guidance is based on work by Leanne Birch, who had done that many years ago. The study was never actually designed to figure out how many exposures you needed, what the minimum was. It was various different experimental conditions, and they found that you could develop a preference with 15 exposures. But it might actually be a little less, it might be a little more, it might vary from kid to kid, it might vary from food to food. So that really is a rough approximation. So you know what? Don't feel like, oh, well, I've tried it 14 times. The 15th time will be magical, because that's not necessarily how it's going to work. So a lot of it is parental exposure, parental modeling, what we're offered to eat. Obviously, if a food is not offered to you, you cannot eat it, and you will not learn to like a food that is not offered to you.
Right.
But there's also our biology. We can't escape the fact that evolution really programmed us to like energy dense things. We're born liking sweet. We're born disliking bitter. We actually know this from some very, very, very old research done back in the 1930s, that the preference for sweetness even predates birth. And the way we know that is if you take saccharin and you inject it into the amniotic fluid, the fetus will actually swallow more. So the fetus will actually drink more amniotic fluid when you sweeten it. Obviously, we wouldn't do that experiment today, but still, it's a really interesting bit of insight to show us that preference for sweetness really is hardwired. Likewise, we really don't tend to like bitterness at birth, but obviously, this is where learning and biology interact with each other, because I'm sitting here drinking my coffee right now, and I drink my coffee black, and it is bitter. And I've
Same.
learned, exactly, I've
Same.
learned,
Cheers.
exactly, I've learned to like my black coffee. And so I often hear people say, oh, well, I don't like bitterness and that's just in my genes. And that's not entirely true, because we obviously look at all the success on the marketplace of all the hoppy beers, or look at now, even without even alcohol, all the hop waters that are out there, or black coffee, or the fact that when you drink that gin and tonic, all that quinine is in there. So we really do learn to like things where we can override that, just in the same way that some of it's cultural and some of it's personal when we think about things like chili peppers. So no baby is born loving chili peppers, and yet some cultures, they're introduced around age 4 or 5, and then it just becomes a ubiquitous part of the diet. Here in the United States, hot sauce is ubiquitously available but not ubiquitously consumed. And what I mean by that is, I can easily reach for that bottle of sriracha and put it on my food, but not every single dish culturally and culinarily is expected to be hot like it would in some other cultures.
Right, right. So when we talk about children versus adults, for example, and enjoy that swig of bitter coffee, I think that's so funny that you mentioned that, because I too trained myself to like black coffee. I used to drink it with cream and sugar and just as sweet as I could make it. And eventually I was like, this isn't helping. So I switched over to bitter. But, anyways, that's a side note. Um, when you think about children's taste buds, they're born with taste buds, but they change over time. Can you tell us sort of the difference between children and their taste buds versus an adult's taste buds?
Sure. So I think there's a little bit of a black box here. Even in 2025, there's still a lot we don't know, because a lot of the methods and techniques that we can use to understand food preferences in adults, you just can't use in children because they're not cognitively able to engage in these tasks. But I think it's really important to remember that we can separate this sort of causal chain of where there's the sensation that we have, and then there's our affective response to that sensation. So you and I might eat spicy food. We might eat the same chili pepper and get the exact same sensation, and then I really like it and you don't, or vice versa. And so that would be an affective difference. Well, there could also be a true sensory difference, where a lot of the work we've done over the last 15 years has been looking at genetic differences across people, where you and I can taste the exact same sweetener. So if I go and I pick up, just so happens I really didn't even plan this, but I pick up these, whether or not you get bitterness from this one is totally independent statistically from whether or not you get bitterness from this one, because this goes through a bitter taste receptor gene called TAS2R31, and this goes through a bitter taste receptor gene called TAS2R4. And you can be high for both, low for both, high for one, high for the other, and so on.
So just for the people who are listening and not watching us
Yep.
have this conversation, the pink packet is
Saccharin.
and the yellow is
And
Splenda, correct?
No, this green one was actually
green
stevia.
was
It was Rhabdotioside, but it was a stevia based one, right? And so where I was going with that is that just like some people can be colorblind, some people can be taste blind to certain chemicals. So they can taste everything else perfectly normally, but they just don't experience it. So another example, if you've ever had a peppery red wine from Australia, like a Shiraz, some people can smell that chemical rotundone and other people can't. And that's just a fundamental difference in your biology, and no amount of training. If you lack that receptor to perceive that peppery note in that red wine, no amount of wine tasting and wine training and can ever teach you to experience something that you just lack the equipment for. And so, I'm sorry.
So, are
Yeah.
there other examples of that? I'm thinking of like the cilantro soapy taste that some people say they have, and they hate cilantro. Are there other examples of these taste receptors that get expressed?
Yep. So that's a great point. That unfortunately doing this research is a little tricky because once the initial science of figuring out that this variation exists um, was sort of a settled matter, trying to dot all the I's and cross all the T's got a lot harder because, um, candidly, the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health are not interested in whether or not you like cilantro on your burrito.
Hmm.
And so trying to get people to fund that work has been a little trickier. But from 23andMe, it is thought that there's a specific odor receptor that explains whether or not you like cilantro. We already talked about saccharin and stevia have two different bitter receptors. There's a third bitter receptor, TAS2R38, which is probably the most famous of them all. If you've ever had one of those little PTC strips of paper that some people can taste and other people can't in middle school science class,
Hmm.
that's also another genetic difference. And that one's really interesting because that same gene variant maps onto whether or not you like beer, whether or not you like cruciferous vegetables.
Hmm.
Um, but it's totally independent from whether or not you like saccharin or whether or not you like stevia.
Interesting.
There's another odor receptor that's responsible for the ability to smell a defect in pork called boar taint, which comes from the animal welfare standards of whether or not you've castrated the pigs.
Hmm.
And so it actually smells like body odor. It smells like a 14-year-old boy's bedroom. It is that sort of like funky, characteristic, musky teenage boy smell.
Hmm.
Well, nobody wants to eat that in their pork chop. But it turns
Correct.
out some people can smell that and other people can't.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that there's other than the taste buds in and of themselves, there's other factors happening here. You've mentioned odor or aroma, right? What other sensory attributes are sort of part of this whole food preference, flavor preference development?
So we also know that kids are very susceptible to textures. And so food texture is also a big driver of acceptance. And it's less that the texture is about liking, although that's certainly true as well. That really, think about a really nice chocolate truffle or a chocolate mousse where that sublime, smooth texture is highly desirable. But really, when we think about texture if we're making very broad strokes, we think about texture as something that makes people reject foods. So we don't like foods that are slimy. We don't like foods that are gristly. We don't like foods that are gritty. But of course, there are massive cultural differences there. Um, when you go to hot pot with my Chinese grad students, they like things that I don't like. Or when I was in China and got to have chicken feet, I'm not personally a fan, but I know lots of people love chicken feet.
Hmm.
And so there are big cultural differences there as well in
Hmm.
terms of the kinds of textures that people like.
Hmm. Interesting. So interesting. I know that in my work with children, particularly those who present as what I'll say in air quotes, extremely picky, there's a lot going on. There is, and you never know what the sensitivity is from a sensory component. You really have to like work with the child and understand their overall dietary patterns. But there could be uh, aversion to aroma. There can be aversion to texture. There can be aversion to just the way something looks. I've had so many kids say it's too wet. They don't like, juicy fruit because it looks too wet. So it's very interesting how it's not just the taste buds on the tongue, but it's like almost the entire context of food itself, the environment, what it looks like, and all the sensory integration of these different senses. Talk to me about sensory integration and how it may disrupt sort of I don't want to use the word normal, but what you would expect in terms of flavor preferences and preference development?
Sure. Before we even get into that, I just want to say I completely agree with you. If we take an anthropological lens on this, food must be good to think before it's good to eat. And so we really are, that starts with looking at that food.
Yeah.
And if something looks a little off and looks a little moldy, maybe it's fine. We still don't want to eat it. Or it might be culturally we don't want to eat it, right? Americans are not especially interested in eating horse, where many Europeans don't seem to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so the food even has to be acceptable in an abstract sense. But to talk about flavor integration, which was your actual question, and I don't want to filibuster your question away. Really, we can think about three different neuroanatomical systems that feed into that perception. So that's smell, that's taste, and then that's touch. And so touch, historically, we've sort of separated chemical touch from sort of more traditional tactile physical touch. And what I mean by that is when I have mint chewing gum, or I have that mojito with the mint leaf in it, or when I have a chili pepper, those are actually activating touch nerves, not taste nerves or smell nerves.
Hmm.
And so we get all those sort of inputs. Or you can think about, the drying that you get from Greek yogurt or chocolate or green tea. Those are going to also get integrated into that flavor perception. And so flavor is all the different anatomical signals feed right forward here to the orbital frontal cortex in the front part of the brain. And those signals are put together. And the brain's actually really quite good at filling in the gaps. So if I give you sort of some ambiguous signal, your brain will still sort of pop it into that sense, which is why you can have a grape Jolly Rancher that just has like one single chemical in there and it's sweet and it's a little sour from the citric acid, and your brain goes, okay, yeah, that's great. But for some people, of course, we know that integration seems to be disrupted somehow,
Mm-hmm.
and really can cause people to struggle with one specific part. Unfortunately, we don't really have great research on what's causing that, right? You definitely see it clinically. And as you said, you have to teach, it's sort of the difference between an epidemiologist working on a population versus a physician working on an individual patient. Well, I tend to do my research in large samples because we're really interested in democratizing taste and sort of figuring out what the average person likes. But that also means all the techniques and tools we've developed are really, really bad for studying that one individual patient.
Yeah. Yeah. So what have you found in your research? What would you say would be like some of the top findings, maybe the top three findings in your career around sort of flavor preference, taste development that have just been great in terms of insight into this whole field?
I think what psychologists would call individual differences, the fact that there isn't a one size fits all, the fact that there isn't a really normative experience, as we already talked about, that you and I could each reach for that sweet and low packet at the diner and put that in our coffee, and have that saccharin and have wildly different experiences from that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that, cultural differences can also drive those individual differences. I have a colleague who is European, and she cannot stand root beer
Hmm.
because Europeans don't grow up drinking root beer for the most part, whereas Americans think, oh, it's root beer, of course. But it really kind of has sort of an herbal medicinal taste when you actually step back a little
Yeah.
bit. So I think the really big breakthrough is ever since the Human Genome Project really unlocked the code of the molecular genetics of first the taste receptors and then the odor receptors, and then this third class of receptors, the trip channels, which are responsible for the burn of chili peppers and the cooling of menthol. Over the last 20 years, we've really unlocked the molecular biology of how these senses work, and have also found that people are wildly different. So you and I can have the exact same food and have a very different sensory experience. But I think the other thing that I've been really excited to work on in my career has been to look at the intersection of things like personality traits. the fact that you and I could have the exact same sensory response, but that affective response could differ wildly. So whether or not you or I like it, whether or not you want to have that extra squirt of hot sauce is actually related to personality traits like risk taking, impulsivity, sensation seeking, novelty seeking. We actually found in one of our studies that the number one predictor of if I can only ask you one question and I want to predict whether or not you're going to like spicy food, it's I should ask you if you like driving fast on a twisty road.
Really?
And so there
That's
really does,
wild.
yeah, it's amazing to think that we can move to this psychographic world beyond this demographic world of instead of saying, I'm a 50-year-old white man from the Northeast, so this is what John's going to like, and instead say, here's a personality profile. What's this person going to like?
Yeah.
I think it's really cool.
I think that's really cool too, because I actually can see temperament traits in children, easygoing versus risk taker versus, you know, needs more time to warm up to things. And that plays into things like picky eating, for example, their willingness to try new foods, their willingness to just even be open to having, different food experiences, which is I find so interesting. So kind of circling back to this nurture versus nature, there's what I hear you saying is there's a genetic component, strong genetic component, that's your nature. Let's talk a little bit about the nurture. What have you so talk to me from not just the individual level in terms of what parents can do to nurture, you know, uh, food preferences in their children, but also talk to me on the commercial level, because you're taking some of this research, I imagine, and applying it to, you know, companies,
Right.
how they, design their food products and how they market. Because if you're talking about personality and risk take, all that stuff, that goes into the marketing. That speaks marketing to me, anyways.
Right.
Um, so talk to me about those two aspects.
So you're absolutely right about the that food companies use these kind of approaches. Ironically, though, just because of a sort of philosophical and historical split in the field, there tends to be a bit of a bright line between the sensory and consumer scientists and the market researchers. And they talk to each other, but they have very different views of the world and very different approaches to the world. So a large part of the work that I do is actually trying to working so hard to try and strip all the marketing out
Mm-hmm.
and to do blind taste tests so
Mm-hmm.
that in an R&D context you can optimize a product. Because if I work for PepsiCo or I work for Coca-Cola, regardless of what product I make, whatever formulation I come up with, if I work for Coke, it's going to have Coke on the label, and if I work for Pepsi. So we actually do a lot with blind taste tests where we're removing all that prior learning because we want to really minimize all that bias. We're not telling you the price, we're not telling you the brand.
Mm-hmm.
We're giving to you in a little plastic cup inside a taste test booth is the classic way to do that. Of course, as a field, we're starting to realize most people don't eat in a closet, so maybe that's a little artificial.
Yeah.
So we're starting to do things with looking at video recording, or people are starting to use smart speakers so you can actually interact with the consumer in their kitchen while they're cooking and do those sort of that kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but one of the things that I've been really excited that to you asked me about the third. You asked me to talk about the things I'm most excited in my career. So the individual differences and the personality traits. But the third big one is texture is the next great frontier. I just got back from a conference called Food Oral Processing, where really looking at physicists, biologists, food scientists, nutritionists, trying to figure out the process of chewing and forming that bolus and swallowing and how that affects eating behavior and how that affects downstream metabolic processing. And we've been playing a lot lately with this idea that if we slow down eating rate a little bit, we can actually help you eat less energy. And so there's about a decade of work now showing that if you make food just a little bit harder, right? I'm not talking about giving you beef jerky that's so tough you can't eat it. But
Right.
if I give you, a Kaiser roll instead of a brioche bun for your hamburger, or if I give you a rice pilaf instead of a risotto, you can slow people down. Well, we've just done some work doing that with spicy food because, of course, that is one of my passion projects is working on spiciness. And what we've actually shown is that if we make the chicken tikka masala a little hotter, or we make the beef chili a little bit hotter, we can actually reduce your energy intake pretty substantially.
So
Uh,
that is so fascinating because some of the work that I do with children who are growing at an accelerated rate or are growing up with a larger body, one of the complaints that the parents will often share is that their child eats too fast.
mhm.
And so we do a lot of work, or I do a lot of work with them on slowing down the pace of eating and bringing more mindfulness into eating in the context of helping them be more aware of their sensation of fullness
Right.
and satisfaction and lower energy intake as a result.
Right. And
So,
so one of the things that a project we did on snacking last year is we actually showed if we gave people the exact same amount, the same mass of pretzels, and we used commercial pretzels that are already on the market, and we gave people the small ones, the medium ones, and the large ones, but gave them the same weight, and then measured how much they ate, we actually found that when you give people the smaller pretzels, they actually eat less overall
hmm,
because they eat slower. Now, I had actually thought it might be a bathtub shape to the curve because I thought if they're small enough, people might just take a handful and toss them back, but that's not actually what we saw.
mhm,
Um, and what was really interesting was it depends on what you want to optimize for, because if you want to optimize for energy intake, you want to eat the smallest ones. But the smallest ones also have the most surface area, which means they have the highest sodium content
mhm,
because the salt on a pretzel is on the outside.
yeah,
Most of it's on the outside. So then if you want to, so the people that had the smallest pretzels ate less, but they had more sodium intake. So if
mm,
you want to minimize your sodium intake, you want to eat the largest pretzels. And then we took it a step further where we actually looked at dip. We did it both with Cool Ranch Doritos and ranch dip, and then we also did pretzels with hummus. And what we found out is that dip is just a double whammy. It's not your friend when it comes to energy intake. Because not only do you not compensate for the energy of you eat just as many chips as you would eat without the dip, and then you have all the calories from the dip on top,
mhm,
but then the dip actually lubricates that food and speeds up bolus formation, and you swallow faster. And so then you actually eat more. So lubricating the food actually increases eating rate. So
interesting.
instead of slowing eating rate down, which is what we might often want to do. But this also suggests that if you have a child who's underweight, that maybe giving them the dip is a great idea. Or you have an aging parent who's struggling to get enough energy.
Yeah.
Maybe something especially you can think about older folks with problems with their dentition. I know at the end of his life, my dad complained that food was just too hard to chew and he
Yeah.
only wanted to eat soft food.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You talked about salty foods. Just to circle back in terms of, you mentioned that sweet was sort of hardwired. The preference for sweet was hardwired. Where does saltiness fit into that? Because I know for like children under 2, we're always like no added salt, no
Right.
added sugar.
Right.
Um, so where does the preference for salt sort of come into play?
So that's actually a tricky one. That in some ways the jury is out. The classic dogma in the field, there are some older studies that are really widely publicized that claim that newborns are indifferent to saltiness, based on facial reactivity and various other measures that you have to use with a newborn, with a neonate. But there is a contradictory line of research that actually shows that if you hook a pressure transducer up to a rubber nipple and then give saltwater solutions and then measure how hard the baby will suck on that rubber nipple, there are, again, individual differences. And some babies actually really do like that salty water. And what's really interesting is those babies tend to come from families who have family histories of hypertension. So,
Interesting.
yeah. So maybe it's an environment thing of you grew up in a house where people are eating more salty food
Hmm.
and mom's exposing you to more salt in utero. But then again, that's pretty highly regulated. So maybe there's not in utero exposure. Really, the question is wide open scientifically. But I think the other key thing to know about salt is you can shift your preferences for salt. If you go on a low salt diet, you will learn to like less salt.
Mm-hmm.
That is not necessarily true for other tastes, right? So the 2010 Institute of Medicine report on sodium intake specifically talks about the idea that we could slowly ratchet down the amount of salt and people would get used to it. And people assume that that's true for other tastes like sweetness, and it turns out that there's no evidence in the literature to support that idea. So people are trying to set policy on that front, that if we just took all the sugar out of food, people would learn to like it. There's actually no science to back that up. People are way
Really?
over their skis on that.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, so we are facing right now just a lot of information um, that suggests if we just sort of changed our food supply in simplistic ways, that we would sort of reverse all the health challenges that Americans are facing today. I suspect from a flavor standpoint that doesn't really pan out, just based on what you just stated.
No, and if it were easy to change, food companies would have already done it. I mean, I hate to say it, but I get lots of, I read lots of applications every year from students who say, "Oh, I want to come and I want to make the food supply better." And that's great. And I want to make the food supply better. And I've consulted with food companies to try and do that. But if it were really easy to do, people would have already done it. It's
Yeah,
not some grand conspiracy that they just want to sell you corn syrup.
yeah,
People like things that are sweet. People like things that are soft and fast and easy to eat. People like things where they don't have to chew very much. And so we're really fighting an uphill battle against evolution. Um, the number one restriction on most people's caloric intake historically was, frankly, they were too poor to afford enough calories,
hmm,
right? So if you go back and you actually look at everyone's graphs of the BMI trends over time, always stop in 1970, or some data sets will go back to 1950. But it turns out if you go back to right after the Civil War, even then, BMI just started climbing and climbing and climbing. As we got more and more affluent, we were finally able to afford enough calories to not be hungry all the time.
hmm, yeah. It's so interesting, and so I guess my next question would be around, convenience and ultra processed foods, and that's really, the ultra processed foods are really sort of getting hammered in the media. I have Google alerts set up for that, and every day I have 8 or 10, articles that have come out overnight around ultra processed foods. How, though, do the sensory attributes of these foods potentially make it harder for children to develop food preferences for whole foods
Right.
like
Well,
fruits and
I,
vegetables?
I even want to push back on the premise a little bit. It's not about the processing, right? Ultra processing creates a great simplistic villain. It's very easy to throw processing under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And ultra processed foods, I'm not saying they're good for you. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not an apologist for ultra processed foods, but it really is one of these things of, it's all about the framing and the mental framework in which you're thinking about these things, because all those ultra processed foods that are problematic are actually also highly energy dense foods.
Yes.
They're full of fat, they're full of sugar, and we've known that for decades. So in some ways, ultra processed food is just, it's really just rebranding junk food in a way that sounds fancy and scientific, but it really isn't, because there's no consensus over what makes a food ultra processed versus conventionally processed versus minimally processed, or the fact that if we buy a loaf of bread from that's made in a factory, that's one level of classification in the ultra processed scheme. But if I buy it at my corner bakery, it's a different level of processing.
Mm-hmm.
My body does not care whether it came from a factory or my artisanal baker around the corner.
Yeah.
Um, but to answer your question about learning to like these things, I think that is, we did do a project a few years ago that was really, I was really disappointed in the results, in that flavor learning comes with exposure, as we talked about right at the top. And so when you go and you buy baby food, you feel good about buying that spinach, kale baby food.
Mm-hmm.
It's blended, it might be spinach, banana. So you're thinking, oh, fruits and vegetables, my kid's learning to like those green vegetables that maybe have the tastes that aren't quite as just innately pleasant as applesauce.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, in the vast majority of those products, um, they're so fruit forward that they might have spinach on the label, but you're really not tasting much spinach,
Yeah.
right?
You're tasting
So
sweet. Yeah.
yeah, so they're sweet. And why do they taste sweet? Because people like things that are sweet. And so, again, it's not a grand conspiracy to hook you on sugar. It's that if I give you product A and I give you product B in a blind taste test, and product A is sweeter than product B, product A is probably going to win.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. Do you know Julie Manila?
I
I
do.
think
I
maybe
do.
we spoke about her when we met a few months ago. I had her on the podcast, oh gosh, probably 3 or 4 years ago now. But she and I talked about flavor learning and this idea that at 4 months of age, you can take tiny, tiny, tiny bits of pureed food on the tip of your pinky and place it on your infant's tongue, and you're sort of priming the palate. You're teaching your It's not about food consumption, it's not about starting solids too early. We recommend for starting solids to happen at 6 months. Just want to put that out there for listeners. But flavor learning is a different thing, and she was really a proponent of that. What's your sort of sense in terms of priming that palate early on to
Yeah,
help
I'm really in
mindfulness?
awe of some of Julie's work, that she's done some of the really canonical stuff looking at both even what mom eats while pregnant, can some of those flavor compounds can get again into the amniotic fluid and can actually cause that flavor priming even before birth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we know that when mom eats while breastfeeding, that a lot of those flavor compounds will actually get into the breast milk and can actually help the child learn to like those flavors as well. So Julie's done some really fantastic stuff. I'll admit, when my kids were little, N of two experiment, just as a dad, um, life was pretty hectic. I was finishing up graduate school. My wife was a medical resident who worked 100 hours a week. Just keeping my kids alive and fed was considered a win.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so, I didn't have time to sit there and, put sweet potatoes on my fingertip when they were 4 months old and rub it on their gums. Didn't happen in the Hayes household.
Yes.
But I will say we did a lot of, well, I'm cooking this food in the kitchen and my daughter's sitting in there in the high chair. She's going to get a little piece of it after we've introduced solid foods, but eating the same food we do, not giving different meals.
Mm-hmm.
And so really just sort of setting the expectation that at the family table, these are the foods we eat. And so it might be, to the toddler, if I'm making the stir fry, um, maybe the sweet potatoes and the tofu are going to get cubed up and then they'll go on the toddler's tray instead of just into the stir fry. I'm
Yeah.
probably not giving the curry to the toddler. But I think, that just repeat exposure,
Mm-hmm.
but also when they get a little older and have some autonomy, not making everything a drag out battle, right? Not
Yeah.
making it a struggle of wills. As you said, temperament plays such a massive role, and that intersection of parenting style,
Mm-hmm.
parental feeding habits, and temperament works out great for some people, and for other people, it's just not a good. Things don't align.
Right, right. I think you know this, but I have 4 kids, and I think about that first baby. I was so careful about what I introduced, when I introduced it, the combination. By the time I had the third daughter, uh, you know, she was eating mustard and pickles and hot sauce and tomato juice and whatever we were all eating. And she was very young and exposed to a lot of spicy stuff at a very young age. And she, to this day, is like hot sauce on everything.
Hmm.
More Tabasco in my tomato juice, the better.
Hmm. Yep.
And I do think that, there's this idea of food exposure early on that's super powerful for a lot of families. But I also, really appreciate your point that every child is different and this is highly individual. It has some genetic backbone to it. And, having more information around what we know about flavor preference development, what we know about sort of the genetic makeup of children and how they're going to react, and then setting that in the entire context of what's your parenting style, what's your economics, what food can be brought into the home, what's your cultural background, like the whole picture is really so very important. As we sort of wrap up our conversation, if you had one piece of advice, and I suspect you might have hinted to this already, but one piece of advice you'd give parents about developing their children's food preferences that is also supported by the science that you know so well, what would that be?
Exposure, exposure, exposure. But I also think, also know when to keep your powder dry and pick your battles, right? My son, and I don't mean to hold up my own parenting as a paragon of parenting, certainly not doing that.
Me neither.
But just, there's certain vegetables he doesn't like.
Mm-hmm.
And we cook the vegetable and he doesn't like that. And if that's the vegetable that's offered that day, he just gets told, go get a piece of fruit, go get something else,
Mm-hmm.
empower him to do some decision making. And so, or, my daughter, there's some vegetables she does like and others she doesn't. And, trying to negotiate okay, we need to accommodate 4 or 5 different people's dietary needs and wants. And so there are certain vegetables that don't get cooked because half the family won't eat them. And then there are other vegetables that they do get cooked, even though half the family won't eat them. And then it's a matter of, okay, just have something else.
Mm-hmm.
You can swap it out, right? We're not a Michelin star restaurant that doesn't allow substitutions either.
Right. Exactly. I love it. Just real quick, in terms of your research and your work, what are you excited about on the horizon?
As I said, texture is the next great frontier. I was actually really excited to start working on texture in 2019 when I did my sabbatical with the goal of really pivoting a lot of our research to that. And then COVID came along and completely derailed me for about 4 years. And I got pulled into the COVID smell loss world. And so now I've really sort of just within the last 18 months, gotten back into really trying to understand texture because there's so many unanswered questions. And as I said, I think it's really exciting, this idea that we can meet people where they are and help them reduce energy overconsumption while still preserving the pleasure from food. That's the part that I didn't land the plane on earlier, which was when we make that chicken tikka hotter, or we make that chili hotter, or we give people the different size pretzels, we're not affecting liking. We're not making things gross. Because if I just made things gross and you ate less, that'd be really obvious.
Right.
But no one's going to live like that. So the idea that I can actually make food that you like equally well and you're just as happy with, but now you've eaten 15 or 20% less because we slowed you down. I just think it's a really cool target. And it's a case where the food industry can become a partner by, if they can do things like, make that bread a little bit chewier, or make that thing that eating rate can be such a target for this. And in fact, there's a giant clinical trial that's just going to come out in the next week or two that's been looking at exactly this issue. And the data is embargoed, and I'm not part of it, so I can't tell you what's going to happen, but keep your eyes peeled. There's going to be a massive amount of media coverage coming about how we can manipulate food texture to slow down eating rate.
Oh, I love it. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate your insight, your expertise, and sharing all your knowledge with my audience. Folks, if you enjoyed this show, make sure you tap like on your app, follow the show, and don't forget, make sure you give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.